82 years old, 40 years of Senate experience. The most powerful Republican in America versus 32 years old, second-term representative, zero Senate experience. On paper, McConnell's victory was guaranteed. In reality, it was too. Except nobody realized that Jasmine was playing to lose. The morning of January 23, 2025, dawned cold and gray over the United States Capitol, a fitting backdrop for what would become the beginning of the most sophisticated political revenge campaign in Senate history. At exactly 9:47 a.m., Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell exercised his procedural authority to silence Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett during a joint committee hearing on voting rights legislation. To the casual observer, McConnell had simply used his decades of parliamentary expertise to outmaneuver a young representative who had overstepped her bounds. But to those who truly understood the chess game of Washington politics, something far more complex and dangerous had just begun. Jasmine Crockett sat in the witness chair, her prepared testimony interrupted mid-sentence by McConnell's invocation of Senate Rule 19, subsection 7, which prohibited House members from making certain statements during joint congressional proceedings. The room fell silent as McConnell's gravelly voice echoed through the committee chamber. The gentlewoman from Texas will suspend her remarks. Her statements violate parliamentary procedure and will be stricken from the record. What the 47 people in that committee room didn't know, what McConnell himself couldn't have imagined, was that Jasmine had been hoping for exactly this moment for the past 6 months. She had carefully crafted her testimony not to persuade the committee, but to provoke precisely the kind of procedural silencing that McConnell was famous for employing against his political opponents. The 82-year-old Senate veteran had just walked directly into a trap that had been 184 days in the making. The origins of this confrontation stretched back to July 2024, when Jasmine had first begun studying McConnell's procedural tactics during her service on the House Administration Committee. She had spent hundreds of hours analyzing transcripts of Senate proceedings, identifying patterns in how McConnell used parliamentary rules to control debate and silence opposition voices. What she discovered was both impressive and infuriating. McConnell had perfected a system of procedural warfare that allowed him to defeat opponents without ever having to address the substance of their arguments. But Jasmine had also discovered something else, something that would prove to be McConnell's undoing. In her deep dive into Senate procedures and McConnell's strategic methods, she had identified 17 different ways that his own procedural weapons could be turned against him. Not immediately, not obviously, but through a carefully orchestrated long-term campaign that would systematically dismantle his political effectiveness while appearing to be nothing more than routine congressional business. The key insight that would drive everything that followed was this: McConnell's power came not from any official authority, but from other senators' fear of his procedural expertise and their reluctance to challenge his control of the Senate's agenda. If that fear could be systematically eroded, if McConnell could be made to appear procedurally incompetent rather than strategically brilliant, his entire power structure would collapse like a house of cards. As Jasmine sat in that committee chair on January 23rd, absorbing McConnell's public rebuke with apparent humility, she was already implementing phase 1 of what would become known in political circles as the McConnell Project. Her goal wasn't to defeat him in this moment. It was to begin a process that would, over the next 4 months, completely destroy his reputation as the master of Senate procedure and reduce him from the most feared parliamentarian in Washington to a confused old man struggling to keep up with opponents who had learned to use his own weapons against him. The committee hearing concluded with McConnell looking satisfied and Jasmine appearing appropriately chastened. Committee Chairman Senator Richard Durbin apologized to McConnell for the procedural irregularity and assured him that future joint hearings would be conducted with proper attention to Senate protocol. McConnell nodded graciously, completely unaware that he had just given Jasmine everything she needed to begin systematically dismantling his legacy. Phase 1 of the McConnell Project began exactly 72 hours later, when Jasmine introduced what appeared to be a routine procedural motion in the House Administration Committee. House Resolution 847, titled Standardization of Interchamber Parliamentary Procedures, was a 19-page document that seemed designed to clarify the rules governing joint House-Senate proceedings. To anyone reading it casually, it appeared to be exactly the kind of boring administrative housekeeping that Congress regularly conducted. But buried in the technical language of H.R. 847 were provisions that would fundamentally alter how Senate procedural rules could be applied during joint proceedings. The resolution created new requirements for procedural objections, established appeal processes for silenced members, and most importantly, created a mechanism for challenging the parliamentary interpretations of committee chairs and ranking members. McConnell's office reviewed the resolution as a matter of routine. After all, procedural changes affecting joint proceedings required Senate approval, and found nothing concerning. The language was dense but standard, the provisions seemed reasonable, and the overall effect appeared to be exactly what the title suggested: standardization of existing procedures. What McConnell's staff missed, what Jasmine had carefully disguised in legislative language that would have impressed the most skilled parliamentary attorneys, was that H.R. 847 would effectively neutralize most of the procedural weapons that McConnell regularly used to control debate. The resolution didn't eliminate his authority to invoke Senate rules, but it created so many new requirements and appeal processes that exercising that authority would become prohibitively time-consuming and politically costly. H.R. 847 passed the House Administration Committee on February 3rd by a vote of 8-5, with all Democrats supporting and all Republicans opposing. It passed the full House on February 12th by a margin of 221-209, again along party lines. The Senate received the resolution on February 15th, where it was referred to the Rules Committee and promptly forgotten by everyone except Jasmine Crockett, who had begun Phase 2 of her project the moment the House vote was completed. Phase 2 involved what Jasmine privately called procedural education, a systematic campaign to teach Democratic senators and representatives how to use McConnell's own parliamentary tactics against him. Over the course of 6 weeks, Jasmine conducted 17 different training sessions for Democratic members, sharing everything she had learned about Senate procedure and demonstrating how specific rules could be employed to frustrate McConnell's agenda. The training sessions were disguised as routine briefings on parliamentary procedure, the kind of educational programming that Congress regularly provided to its members. But Jasmine had essentially created a master class in anti-McConnell warfare, teaching dozens of Democratic legislators how to identify and exploit the procedural vulnerabilities that she had discovered in McConnell's methods. The first test of this new knowledge came on March 8th, during a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on judicial nominations. Senator Amy Klobuchar, armed with techniques learned in Jasmine's training sessions, used a previously obscure parliamentary procedure to force McConnell into a series of time-consuming procedural disputes that delayed committee business for 3 hours and made him appear confused and unprepared. McConnell was clearly frustrated by the unexpected procedural challenges, but he attributed them to Democratic obstructionism rather than any systematic campaign against his authority. He had no reason to suspect that a House representative was orchestrating a coordinated assault on his procedural dominance. The second test came on March 15th, when Senator Elizabeth Warren used another technique from Jasmine's training sessions to challenge McConnell's interpretation of Senate Rule XXI during a floor debate on budget reconciliation. The challenge triggered a complex series of parliamentary procedures that consumed the entire afternoon and resulted in McConnell having to reverse 2 of his earlier rulings. By March 22nd, Democratic senators were regularly employing tactics from Jasmine's training sessions, and McConnell was visibly struggling to maintain control of Senate proceedings. Committee hearings that he had previously dominated were becoming chaotic. Floor debates that he had once controlled through procedural expertise were spiraling into prolonged parliamentary disputes. Most importantly, other senators were beginning to notice that the legendary Mitch McConnell appeared to be losing his mastery of the very rules that had made him the most powerful man in the Senate. This was exactly what Jasmine had anticipated. McConnell's authority had always been based on other senators' belief that he was procedurally invincible. Once that belief began to crack, his entire power structure would become vulnerable. And by early April 2025, the cracks were becoming visible to everyone in Washington. Phase 3 of the McConnell Project launched on April 1st, a date that Jasmine had chosen deliberately. On that morning, 17 different Democratic senators simultaneously introduced procedural challenges to 17 different aspects of McConnell's committee assignments, floor scheduling, and parliamentary interpretations. Each challenge was perfectly legal, properly documented, and strategically designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in McConnell's procedural armor. The effect was devastating. McConnell spent the entire week of April 1st to 5th fighting procedural battles on multiple fronts, each one requiring him to defend interpretations and decisions that he had previously made without challenge. By Friday afternoon, he had been forced to reverse 6 different procedural rulings, delay for committee hearings, and postpone a floor vote on legislation that he had personally prioritized. More importantly, the national political media had begun to notice. Politico published an article titled "McConnell's Procedural Problems" that detailed his recent struggles with parliamentary procedure. The Washington Post ran a piece asking whether the 82-year-old senator was losing his procedural edge. Cable news shows began featuring segments about McConnell's apparent decline in parliamentary effectiveness. But the most damaging coverage came from an unexpected source. Conservative media outlets that had always treated McConnell as a procedural genius began questioning whether he was still the strategic mastermind they had long celebrated. Fox News ran a segment wondering if McConnell had lost a step in his parliamentary game. Conservative podcasters began discussing whether it might be time for new Republican leadership in the Senate. This media narrative was exactly what Jasmine had been working toward. McConnell's power had always depended on the perception that he was procedurally invincible. Once that perception cracked, his authority would begin to crumble from within his own party. And by mid-April 2025, that process was well underway. The final phase of the McConnell Project began on April 18th, when Senate Democrats, armed with 4 months of training in anti-McConnell tactics, launched what they called Procedural Spring, a coordinated campaign to challenge every aspect of McConnell's committee leadership and floor management. Over the course of 1 week, McConnell faced 47 different procedural challenges, 23 appeals of his parliamentary rulings, and 12 formal complaints about his interpretation of Senate rules. The 82-year-old senator, who had once navigated complex parliamentary disputes with the confidence of a master chess player, appeared increasingly confused and frustrated as younger senators systematically dismantled his procedural authority. Committee hearings became parliamentary battlegrounds where McConnell's rulings were regularly challenged and overturned. Floor debates turned into prolonged disputes over rules and procedures that McConnell could no longer control. By April 25th, McConnell's effectiveness as a procedural leader had been so thoroughly undermined that 3 Republican senators privately approached him to suggest that he might want to consider stepping down from his leadership position. The conversation was leaked to Politico within hours, creating a media firestorm about McConnell's political future and raising questions about whether he could continue to lead the Republican caucus. The psychological effect on McConnell was profound and visible. The man who had once intimidated opponents with his parliamentary expertise now appeared uncertain and defensive during routine Senate business. His speeches became shorter and less confident. His procedural interventions became less frequent and less effective. Most tellingly, he began avoiding the kind of complex parliamentary battles that he had once relished. The transformation was so dramatic that political commentators began speculating about McConnell's health and mental acuity. Saturday Night Live created a sketch depicting him as a confused old man who had forgotten how Senate rules worked. Late-night television hosts made him the subject of regular jokes about parliamentary incompetence. The man who had been feared and respected as the master of Senate procedure had become a figure of ridicule and pity. But the most devastating blow came on May 3rd, when Senator Chuck Schumer used a technique that Jasmine had specifically developed for the McConnell Project to force McConnell into a procedural corner that resulted in the majority leader having to publicly admit that he had misinterpreted a fundamental Senate rule. The admission, captured on C-SPAN and immediately turned into viral video clips, showed McConnell looking confused and defeated as he acknowledged that his parliamentary ruling had been incorrect and withdrawn. The clip became a symbol of McConnell's procedural decline and was viewed over 3 million times within 24 hours. Political commentators described it as the moment when McConnell's legendary parliamentary authority finally collapsed. Conservative media outlets that had long defended him began calling for new Republican leadership. Republican senators began openly discussing the need for a leadership change. On May 15, 2025, exactly 113 days after he had silenced Jasmine Crockett in that committee hearing, Mitch McConnell announced that he would step down as Senate Republican leader at the end of the current session. In his resignation statement, he cited his desire to allow new leadership to guide the Republican caucus through the challenges ahead. But those close to McConnell knew the real reason for his resignation. He had been completely outmaneuvered by a young House representative who had turned his own procedural expertise against him. The master of Senate rules had been defeated by an opponent who had learned to play his game better than he could. The political media immediately began analyzing how McConnell's downfall had happened so quickly. Most coverage focused on his age, his health, or the changing dynamics of Senate politics. But a few astute observers began to notice patterns in the procedural challenges that had undermined his authority. A small number of reporters started investigating whether there had been a coordinated campaign against McConnell's leadership. It was Politico's congressional reporter Sarah Ferris who first connected the dots between Jasmine's training sessions for Democratic members and the systematic procedural challenges that had destroyed McConnell's effectiveness. Her May 20th article, titled "The Crockett Connection: How a House Representative Toppled a Senate Leader," revealed the full scope of the McConnell Project for the first time. The article detailed how Jasmine had spent 6 months studying McConnell's methods, developing counter-strategies, training Democratic legislators, and orchestrating a coordinated campaign that systematically destroyed his procedural authority. It explained how her apparent defeat in that January committee hearing had actually been the opening move in a chess game that McConnell never realized he was playing. The revelation that a second-term House representative had single-handedly engineered the downfall of the most powerful Republican senator in America sent shockwaves through Washington. Political scientists called it the most sophisticated long-term political strategy they had ever documented. Congressional scholars described it as a masterclass in how procedural knowledge could be weaponized to defeat seemingly invincible opponents. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from McConnell himself. In a rare television interview 3 weeks after his resignation announcement, he was asked whether he was aware that Jasmine Crockett had been responsible for his procedural difficulties. His response was both gracious and revealing. "I underestimated her. I thought I was dealing with an inexperienced legislator who didn't understand how Washington works. I didn't realize I was facing someone who understood how Washington works better than I did." When asked what he had learned from the experience, McConnell's answer would be quoted in political science textbooks for years to come. "I learned that experience isn't the same as wisdom, and that institutional knowledge isn't the same as strategic thinking. Congresswoman Crockett taught me that the most dangerous opponents aren't the ones who challenge you directly. They're the ones who study your strengths and figure out how to turn them into weaknesses." The interviewer pressed him on whether he felt that Jasmine's campaign against him had been fair. McConnell's response was surprisingly philosophical. "Politics is about power, and power is about understanding how institutions work. I spent 40 years learning how to use Senate procedures to advance my agenda. Congresswoman Crockett spent 6 months learning how to use those same procedures to destroy my effectiveness. She was simply better at the game than I was." 6 months after McConnell's resignation, when Jasmine was invited to speak at a Harvard Kennedy School symposium on legislative strategy, she reflected on the McConnell Project and its implications for American politics. "Senator McConnell taught me that procedural knowledge is a form of power. But he also taught me that power based solely on institutional knowledge is vulnerable to opponents who take the time to understand those institutions better than you do." The McConnell Project wasn't about revenge. It was about demonstrating that no one in American politics is invincible when their opponents are willing to study, prepare, and think strategically. Senator McConnell was a formidable opponent precisely because he understood how to use institutional rules to his advantage. But those same rules could be learned and employed by others who were willing to put in the work. The audience of political scientists, congressional staff, and government students gave Jasmine a standing ovation that lasted for over 4 minutes. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source, a handwritten note from Mitch McConnell himself, delivered to her office the day after the Harvard speech. The note was brief but gracious. "Congresswoman Crockett, you taught me that the student can indeed surpass the teacher. Your strategic thinking and institutional mastery were superior to mine, and you earned your victory. I hope you use the lessons you've learned to strengthen rather than weaken our democratic institutions. Respectfully, Mitch McConnell." The note became public when Jasmine shared it during a later interview, and it cemented her reputation as one of the most strategically sophisticated legislators in Washington. But more importantly, it demonstrated that even the most hardened political adversaries could recognize and respect superior strategic thinking when they encountered it. 1 year after the McConnell Project concluded, political scientists were still studying its implications for congressional power dynamics and institutional strategy. The campaign had demonstrated that traditional advantages, age, experience, institutional knowledge, could be neutralized by opponents who combined careful study with strategic thinking and long-term planning. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the McConnell Project was its demonstration that American political institutions were not controlled by any single individual, no matter how experienced or knowledgeable. When Jasmine Crockett systematically dismantled Mitch McConnell's procedural authority, she proved that democratic institutions belong to whoever understands them most deeply and uses them most effectively. The young Congresswoman who had been silenced by Senate procedure in January had, by May, forced the resignation of the man who had silenced her. She had done it not through dramatic confrontation or public attacks, but through patient study, strategic thinking, and the systematic application of institutional knowledge. She had beaten Mitch McConnell at his own game by learning to play it better than he could. As Jasmine had said in her Harvard speech, Senator McConnell was right to silence me that day in January. I was making statements that violated Senate procedure. But what he didn't realize was that being silenced was exactly what I had hoped would happen. Sometimes the best way to win a game is to let your opponent think they've already won. The 82-year-old Senate veteran had indeed won that January confrontation. But in doing so, he had triggered a strategic response that would end his career and reshape his legacy. He had learned, too late, that in the complex chess game of Washington politics, apparent victories can sometimes be carefully planned defeats in disguise. Mitch McConnell had spent 40 years mastering the art of political warfare. Jasmine Crockett had spent 6 months learning to wage that war more effectively than its acknowledged master. The result was a reminder that in American democracy, institutional power belongs not to those who have held it longest, but to those who understand it best.